Abe's just going to say a word about the format.
Yeah. Well, we just designed this little format, so I thought I'd explain it. By the way, that's Mother Rosalie Hill's quotation, which is the impetus for this, so I thought it might be nice to have it in people's heads. We're talking about beauty, but it's always related to goodness and truth, at least as we see it on this campus. The format is that first Martha and then Malachi and then I will lead us through a sort of set of ideas based upon some quotations that will be up here, so take out your reading glasses if you need them. But the main thing I wanted to say is that we don't want everyone to just wait till the end to ask questions. So as we go, please raise your hand and ask questions. We'd much rather have a conversation than just sort of a question session at the end. Okay? So please feel welcome to do so. Martha?
Thank you. And thanks to University of San Diego for having me. I'm thrilled to be in such august and inquisitive, intensely inquisitive company. All of you, I feel like I'm among kindred spirits here. And I would have arm wrestled Mother Rosalie about the serial comma. Is anybody else on my side here? but she makes a good point. Anyway, my dad was a theologian, and he grew up in a log cabin at the foot of Sugarloaf Mountain in North Carolina. And he later, after he became a theologian, I was in college, and I was trying to get my arms around something like a paper on beauty, just the broad subject of beauty. I was trying to fathom it. You know, fathom is literally the length between your fingertips. I was trying to get my arms around whatever the topic. It might have been beauty, because it might have been the aesthetics course I took. But anyway, I said to my theologian dad, I'm having such a hard time getting around this topic. And he just looked at me and he said, Marth, milk all the cows you can and then churn your own butter. So Abe and Malachi and I are going to give you all something to chew on. And then I would love to see what the herd comes up with. So, as Abe said, please do chime in. We're really looking forward to hearing your thoughts as well. So the English word beauty. Let's see. Yes, the English word beauty and early forms of it have been around since the early 14th century, and it found its way into English from the similar sounding Anglo-French word that sounded like beauté. Is there any Anglo-French experts here? It sounded like beauty. And it meant physical attractiveness or goodness or courtesy. And ultimately, these words go back to the classical Latin bellus, which meant things like pretty or handsome or charming, fine, lovely, neat, pleasant, agreeable. Usually that adjective was applied to women and children. But in any case, descendants of the Latin word bellus we see in the Spanish word belleza, Italian bello, and French beau. And there's speculation that those words may go back even farther to a prehistoric root that gives us words like benevolent and beatitude and bonus. So it's this whole constellation of words that have to do with goodness. And in English, the word beauty edged out an earlier word, which we saw for, oh, there it is. Any Old English experts here? I believe it's pronounced just lita, and it means, as you see, brightness, appearance, look, form, countenance, beauty, splendor, adornment. So not so much character, but it goes back to a word that simply means to gaze or look at or observe. And it's actually related to an obsolete word that we don't use anymore, lit, which means a color or a tint like you might use to dye a cloth. It's not like the lit that some of you younger folks use these days. No relation whatsoever. But it almost goes without saying that beauty itself is dependent on context. There are all these diverse cultural aesthetics around the world about what's beautiful, particularly involving human physical beauty. And cultures where food may be scarce. Often what's prioritized is a big body, a large proportions. And if you think about the Western tradition in particular, the one that's been handed down to us traditionally, then you go back, when you're thinking about beauty, to Plato and the Symposium and his discussion of what he called to kalon, that is the beautiful, the noble, the good. And you would write that out in English as to kalon, Kalon. And we get words from that like calligraphy, which is beautiful writing. We get calisthenics, which is beautiful strength. And for the Greeks, come on in. For the Greeks, physical beauty and beauty of character were all kind of mixed up together. It was a complex concept that was best described, I think, in Plato's dialogue, the Symposium. Does anybody know the roots of the word symposium? It comes from words that mean a drinking together. The symposium was actually a drinking party. The sim means together, and the posium is related to words like potion. So it was a drinking party where people sat around and talked about different topics. And in that particular drinking party, Plato talks about how kalon can refer to physical beauty, such as a human face or a body, or the beauty of the soul or psyche, or it could refer to other concepts like law or the cosmos. And in the Symposium, Socrates, about whom Plato is reporting, Socrates quotes a woman named Diotima, who talks about beauty and love. And she talks about the fact that the search for love, that is erotic love, is a search for beauty. It's ultimately a search for beauty itself in general. And the beautiful beloved inspires the mind and the soul and directs one's attention to spiritual things. And one proceeds from the recognition of another's beauty to appreciation of beauty that exists apart from all that, to the love of divinity itself. And she said, quoted here, "When you see this beauty, it will be brighter than your gold, your garments, your beautiful boys, your young men, or anything else that you seek." And so you philosophers recognize, of course, the idea of the Platonic forms there, the idea that everything that appears to be beautiful does so because it derives its characteristics from the divine form. But the Greeks were also carnal, and they had beauty contests. I was reading about those yesterday. They were called kalisteia, and they were for both women and men. In fact, they had beauty contests in Athens for older men who would be honored by getting to carry olive branches in a procession that was called the thalopheroi. But the values in that culture were, for women, you wanted wide hips and white arms that you might make prettier, so to speak, by blanching them with lead, white lead makeup. Redheads had a particular advantage among women. And one of the most interesting beauty contests in ancient Greece was reported to be that of Aphrodite Kalupagos, or Aphrodite of the beautiful buttocks. In Sicily, they were trying to decide where to put a temple, and so they had two women sort of do a face-off. I guess it wasn't face, but but they had a competition in which people judged their buttocks, and the one who got the most votes, I guess, got to choose where the temple would be built. And from that, we get the word Callipygian. Anybody know that English word meaning having a beautiful butt? Callipygian, Callipygian. If you take away nothing else today. So physical and metaphorical beauty are often entwined, and they reflect a cultural context and values. For example, I'm always reminded of the passage from Song of Songs. You know that one where it paints quite a picture. Let's see. Behold, thou art fair, my love. Just picture this. Behold, thou art fair, my love. Behold, thou art fair. Thou hast dove's eyes within thy locks. Thy hair is a flock of goats that appear from Mount Gilead. Thy feet are like a flock of sheep that are even shorn, which came up from the washing, whereof each one bare twins, and none is barren among them. Thy lips are like a thread of scarlet, and thy speech is comely. Thy temples are like a piece of pomegranate within thy locks. Thy neck is like the Tower of David, builded for an armory, whereon hang 1,000 bucklers, all shields of mighty men. Thy two breasts are like two young roes that are twins, which feed among the lilies. Until the day break and the shadows flee away, I will get me to the mountain of myrrh and to the hill of frankincense. Thou art all fair, my love, there is no spot in thee. Paints quite a picture, but it's a picture of values in the ancient world. And of course, we've always heard the expression, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That goes way back to at least different versions of that from, say, Theocritus, the 3rd century BC poet who said, For in the eyes of love, that which is not beautiful often seems beautiful. And David Hume wrote, beauty, properly speaking, lies in the sentiment or taste of the reader. And on, we've inherited this notion of beauty being in the eyes of the beholder. And then we have Voltaire pushing back against Plato and the Platonic idea of beauty. As you can see, Voltaire said, ask a toad what is beauty. The great beauty, toad Calonne, he will answer that it is the female with 2 great round eyes coming out of her little head, her large flat mouth, her yellow belly, and brown back. So I invite you to take a moment and think of how you would define beauty. And then pity the poor lexicographer whose job it is to try to describe that without pictures and in a way that's succinct, useful, in lapidary prose. Lapidary, I love that word. You all know this word. It comes from the Latin for stone because it's worthy of being chiseled in stone. It's like lapis lazuli or lazuli, however you care to pronounce it. It's got different pronunciations. Anyway, I love that term, lapidary prose. Like you see that on buildings. Anyway, welcome to my brain. Anyway, so I often go back to Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary, and I enjoyed his definition of beauty. He said, an assemblage of graces or an assemblage of properties in the form of the person or any other object which pleases the eye. In the person, due proportion or symmetry of parts constitutes the most essential property to which we annex the term beauty. In the face, regularity and symmetry of the features, the color of the skin, the expression of the eye are among the principal properties which constitute beauty. But as it is hardly possible to define all the properties which constitute beauty, we may observe in general that beauty consists in whatever pleases the eye of the beholder, whether in the human body, in a tree, in a landscape, or any other object. And then we come forward to Merriam-Webster Today, which is online. It's the 11th edition now, but they keep adding to it. And it's a little more succinct. The quality or aggregate of qualities in a person or thing that gives pleasure to the senses or pleasurably exalts the mind or spirit. 2, a beautiful person or thing, like she's a real beauty. A particularly graceful, ornamental, or excellent quality. A brilliant, extreme, or egregious example or instance. Number 5 is bottom. Who knows what that's doing there? This has nothing to do with Calipigian, by the way. Absolutely nothing. Anybody know any physicists? Quark. Yes. Who said quark?
not a physicist, but yeah.
But you just guessed?
No.
Or how do
Top, bottom, charms,
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, educate me about this, because the definition that they had for bottom was,
I don't know the origin of, I don't know why that term was originally applied to quarks.
okay, well, we can talk about that, but can you tell me in plain English what a bottom is in quark talk?
It's a category, so it's not, I don't know that it relates specifically to a property of that type of quark. It just happens to be one of a group of quarks that is, so top, I don't know if top is related to energy state or something like that. The top, bottom, I don't know what charmed means, but that's another type of quark.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Charmed?
Strange, yeah.
Did you all know that?
But how does that get
Do you
to
feel
us
the
to
poem
beauty?
coming on?
Do you know? Does it make
I'm not sure.
Martha? How does that get us to beauty, though? How do we
Oh,
get
how
from
do-
quarks to beauty?
I will tell you.
Oh, okay, good.
Yes.
Because I was confused by you.
Well, it turns out that in the 1970s, physicists predicted the existence of two quarks that they call T and B for top and bottom, but there was this movement among some physicists to, instead of calling them top and bottom, to call them truth and beauty. I just love that. And unfortunately, truth and beauty sort of lost out, except in Webster, in Merriam-Webster's dictionary. But yes, it has to do with their spins. That's all I know to tell you about why they're called top and bottom. Somebody knows that. And for the record, in terms of science, that kind of beauty, the quark kind of beauty, supposedly lasts about 1/10 of a millionth of a second before decaying, which is also kind of beautiful, isn't it? In fact, I'm partial to descriptions of beauty by scientists. I wanted to share this one from Nobel Prize-winning theoretical physicist Richard Feynman, because I love hearing people like him and Stephen Hawking and Einstein talking about this notion of beauty as it pertains to science. Dr. Feynman was talking about how he wanted to learn to draw. And he said, I wanted very much to learn to draw for a reason that I kept to myself. I wanted to convey an emotion I have about the beauty of the world. It's difficult to describe it because it's an emotion. It's analogous to the feeling one has in religion that has to do with a God that controls everything in the whole universe. There's a generality aspect that you feel when you think about how things appear so different and behave so differently are all run behind the scenes by the same organization, the same physical laws. It's an appreciation of the mathematical beauty of nature, of how she works inside, a realization that the phenomena we see result from the complexity of the inner workings between atoms, a feeling of how dramatic and wonderful it is. It's a feeling of awe, of scientific awe, which I felt could be communicated through a drawing to someone who had also had this emotion. It would remind him for a moment of this feeling about the glories of the universe. And it's a reminder, too, that there are so many different kinds of beauty. I mean, I've been talking mainly about physical beauty, but of course, there's beauty in nature, beauty in art, beauty in architecture, beauty in college campuses. This really is the prettiest one I've ever been on. And in music and in dance, I love the comment from Bella Lewitsky, who is a dancer, who said, art is a language, a form of communication, a philosophy, a perception of truth. Art can, in the hands of great talent, make beauty which reverberates throughout our lives and carries us into rarefied strata. The notion of rarefied having to do with sublime. If you're philosophers, you know that the notion of sublime has to do with reaching up almost to the limit. And then there's then there is the Oxford English Dictionary. I can't talk about beauty without quoting the Oxford English Dictionary. It's usually the first place I go. And I thought I had that. Yes. In abstract senses, the quality of a person, especially a woman, which is highly pleasing to the sight, perceived physical perfection, attractive harmony of features, figure or complexion, exceptional grace, elegance or charm in appearance. The quality of a person or thing that is highly pleasing or satisfying to the mind, moral or intellectual excellence. The quality of a physical object or animal which is highly pleasing to the sight, perceived physical perfection, exceptional harmony of form or color. And finally, the quality of a thing which is highly pleasing to the senses generally. And I think that the OED gets to all of what we're talking here, the physical, the moral, the divine, and the sensuality of beauty. And one more thing that I want to touch on in my whirlwind tour of beauty and trying to get my arms around it, is the beauty of words themselves, which will segue naturally into what you guys do. And again, the beauty of individual words depends on the context that we bring to them and the context in which they lie. You know, often we hear about lists of words that people find the most beautiful in and of themselves, English words. Anybody have a favorite? Nobody has a favorite word?
Maybe Willem? We were debating this.
Willem.
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 Yes.
Yeah, it's gorgeous.
Yes, Wilom. Tell me what you like about it.
Well, it has a wistfulness. There's a kind of embedded nostalgia, bygone. It's also a little anachronistic, so it feels selected and not accidentally
Yes,
chosen,
yes.
which I like very much.
So how would you use it in a sentence?
Oh, I think I first encountered it, I don't know in what context, but Willem friends. A sense of congregation of souls who have passed but remain present in some emotionally relevant way.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Who have passed on, like who have died?
Feasibly, yeah. I don't know. I just remember the phrase, not exactly even the text in which I encountered it, but it, charmed me.
That is charming. Yes.
Yeah, I have a comment that actually might lead to the other speakers. It seems like what you're saying is beauty, there's a relationship between the physical and the metaphysical. I mean, particularly with the Greeks.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that part of the human condition is that we're here and we want to be there to a certain degree. So this relationship vertically between the physical and metaphysical. And I kind of think poetry is like the best example of that because it actually talked about the metaphysical through the physical embodiment in the world. And so in that sense, and leaves enough of gaps that you understand is not complete. So therefore you have to complete it. So I think that really is segued nicely into poetry because if it were just sort of strictly metaphysical, I don't think we don't have the grounding in existence. And if it's only grounding existence, then it's really just lust. So I kind of think that connection is kind of an important relationship.
The leap between the words and the ideal, then?
No, between the words, but between being in the world and being above the world in a way.
I mean, I think that to the extent, and sorry, Michelle, that philosophers maybe aren't always making beautiful language. They're making philosophy. And well, you're the Kantian. I never found Kant beautiful. I mean, I wouldn't have said it.
Oh, this is going to be good.
But that the poet may get at the same set of ideas, but in a material sense. I mean, and that's why it's poetry instead of the critique of pure reason.
Anybody else have a thought about that? Well, I will toss it to the poet in just a second. I just wanted to add that in terms of words in themselves being beautiful, my favorite word, at least for now, it's sort of like choosing a favorite child or favorite star or something, is mellifluous. which of course means I'm seeing some nodding back there, which describes a beautiful voice, but literally it means flowing with honey. If you go back to the Latin, it's related to Spanish meal, and I just think that is a poem in and of itself. You know, Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "The etymologist finds the deadest word to have been once a brilliant picture. Language is fossil poetry," and this is part of what motivates me. That just the beauty of seeing that kind of poem in a single word. People do get surveyed from time to time about what's the most beautiful word in the English language, and a lot of times people say things like love or mother, but other people say defenestration or lollygag. So clearly people bring their own associations of meaning to the words besides just the sensuality of a word like that. In fact, there's a story that's gone around for years that someone determined that the most beautiful sounding expression in the English language is cellar door, like the door to the basement. Good that you should, yes, exactly. Tolkien in 1955 gave a speech in which he said that he thought that cellar door was the most beautiful term, and a lot of people think he was the first one to come up with that idea, but actually it had been around for a few decades before that, and Wilfred Funk of Funk and Wagnalls was surveying people and created a list of his favorite words and favorite words that people had come up with, the most beautiful words in the English language, and they included dawn and husband and lullaby. Dorothy Parker, his contemporary, said, "My favorites are check and enclosed." But she also talked about cellar door. So yes, that's a lot of people do associate it with Tolkien. The other word in terms of beauty that any first-year Latin student will recognize is the word pulchritude. One of the first words you learn in Latin class is pulcher, which means pretty or beautiful. And pulchritude is what David Foster Wallace called a paradoxical noun, because it's the opposite of the qualities it denotes. He didn't think that pulchritude was a beautiful word, and he has a whole list of paradoxical nouns, including diminutive, which isn't, and big, which isn't, and monosyllabic, which also isn't. Which leads me to the beauty of arranging words. The word syntax comes from Greek words that mean to marshal an army, to arrange an army. It's related to tactical. So armies of words. Anyway, there is the beauty of what Samuel Taylor Coleridge called the best words in the best order, poetry.
My pleasure. Yeah, well, firstly, yeah, maybe we can... Well, you set a high bar, Martha, so I will be limboing forward, if you guys don't mind. I was thinking quite a bit, in fact, about the issue of materiality in language. It seems to be the thing that motivates most of the poets I know and admire is not the meanings of words per se, though those are certainly cherished, but the bodies in which they are housed, which seems to influence their selection as often as not. And frequently, it's a kind of abstracted embodiment. It's the sounds of words that motivate poets in their choice. And I was thinking immediately of this well-known poem by William Butler Yeats, which maybe has a slightly sexist culmination, so I don't know if we should forgive him or condemn him or both. But it's an interesting argument here. We're getting two excerpts from the poem. It's a conversation of three sitting around talking about poetry. If we wanted to indulge in the biographical fallacy, we might imagine that this is Willie himself and Maud Gunn and her kind friend. But as he says, a line may take us hours maybe, yet if it does not seem a moment's thought, our stitching and unstitching has been naught. Better to go down upon your marrow bones and scrub a kitchen pavement, or break stones like an old pauper in all kinds of weather. For to articulate sweet sounds together is to work harder than all these, and yet be thought an idler by the noisy set of bankers, schoolmasters, and clergymen the martyrs call the world. His female friend responds, to be a woman is to know, although they do not talk of it at school, that we must labor to be beautiful. Certainly, this is something of an ars poetica. I find it interesting that from a quasi-Marxist view, Yeats seems to be making the case that the laborious nature of poetic composition is one of the means by which it should be regarded as beautiful, that it's rare, that it requires hard work, and as a result is of a value that exceeds that which is accidental or maybe aleatory, randomly devised. That's a curious argument, I think, for the value of poetry, that it requires deliberation and intent, but I don't think it's foreign. Certainly, I agree. I make poems, I want them to be regarded as objects of value and beautiful in their value, not alone. But for me, one of the things that I find most unusual is the assertion that poetry is the articulation of sweet sounds together, that mellifluousness to which you earlier alluded, and to a materiality that is not necessarily metaphysical, but almost metatextual, inasmuch as it departs from the space of the semantically charged and intoxicates us on the grounds of its tangibility. I find that to be a very compelling argument, but I think it's interesting in as much as it suggests that Paul Valéry was not mistaken in arguing or claiming that poetry is a language within a language, and that a poet's job is almost curatorial, perhaps to dislocate terms from their standard usage and place them in the museum space of text, to enable us to perceive them as something relieved of the burden of utility. Sweet sounds have no inherent necessity, and I do think, as Yeats proposes, that aesthetic space is a space relieved of the burdens of utility. In part, there's something soiled. These words may be taken out of circulation, like a coin or a battered library book, or perhaps a really valuable library book. And that might be the space of the beautiful, the space of relief from need or use. I don't know that I love the conclusion, as I say, but it does suggest that there might be something verging on the decorative as well. I like this less, but I admit that it seems to be embedded partly in an argument for the value of poems as something that relieves language of their use. A poem by a contemporary poet whose work I find fun describes the poet's job as that of the golf ball cleansing machine.
Oh, good.
Take the ball out of its pummeling, polish it, get the dirt off of it, and then you return it to the species. And you say, oh, you can use it now that it's been cleansed. Maybe there's something in there. But I love, in general, this discussion, and I think Yeats is asking for a certain esteem as a result of this work, which is most commonly marginalized. But I am in love with this idea of materiality. Maybe not metaphysical always, but metatextual. I guess a question I have about this is whether that seems reasonable, that literature is a museum space in a way, that language taken out of circulation, relieved of its denotative value, might be particularly beautiful. I wonder if either of you have a thought on this.
I'm just fanning myself over the golf machine. That is just, you never know what radio show that might end up on. I mean, that is so great. I never thought about it that way before.
No, he's an inventive mind, this gentleman, yeah. I'll be happy to send you the link.
Yes,
Yeah.
okay, please do. That's great. Yes. I think so. I think so. I'm thinking about art galleries as well, and how they create that psychical distance that allows us to appreciate form in a different way. I think it was Kandinsky who said to see the formal elements of a painting, you have to turn it upside down. And I think that what you're talking about, in a way, poetry and literature do that, right? For ideas and narrative.
Well, I'm wondering if either of you think that actually that's also the work you do, Martha, when you draw attention here on the radio to the etymologies of words. Often they are surprising or bring in other histories that you didn't know were there. So I'm wondering if that work is the same kind of dissociative work that you do, Malachi, when you put a word into a poem, or of a different sort.
I think certainly in that Emersonian notion, the argument is for the recovery of dead metaphor. And I do think of metaphorical action as something that is maybe not gratuitous, but exceeds simple necessity. It's not decorative because it's expressive and it offers a unique and inimitable value, but it is something beyond the standard requirements of communication. So I do see a deep similarity in recovering etymologies. I was delighted to learn in college through the OED that brazen meant brass, brassy. I hadn't known that, but then suddenly a category of my experience and my tongue were revealed to me, and my world was enriched by virtue of this very colorful and very shiny new piece of knowledge. So yeah, I do think that there is this displacement and dissociation from the transparency of simple denotative values. I mean, do you agree?
I do agree. I think there's, at least for somebody like me who is so obsessed with the origins of words, and I'm thinking also of Thomas Carlyle, who said the coldest word was once a glowing new metaphor. You know, and so often we are using the words when they're already cooled off, but you can retrace its word steps through history. But you can do too much of that too, I have to confess. For somebody like me, it is really hard to read fiction sometimes, because did anybody else have this problem? My mind is just ricocheting all of this. I used to be a reporter for the Washington Post and then for a newspaper in my native Kentucky, and for a while there I was covering medical issues, and I was talking to doctors all the time. And talk about people who speak in poetry. You can't read their writing, but they talk in poetry. I mean, somebody would talk about, you know, we're going to do some fulguration, and I would think, oh, the Latin word for lightning is in there, and I would completely, you know, I just about dropped my notebook trying to follow what the guy was talking about, because he was talking about suturing and. The mitral valve of the heart. I mean, we're at a Catholic college. It's like the mitre, like a bishop's mitre, because of the shape of it. So it can also be distracting for me. I mean, there's got to be a certain balance, I think, between going too deep and hanging on to the actual meaning of what's trying to be conveyed. But do you find that at all? When you come across brazen, you don't get that distracted? Or other poetic kinds of...
I think there are instances of absorptive language and resistant language. There's a certain opacity that these yield that is, you know, that provides its own unique pleasure. But I think a good poem to make a case needs to disappear sometimes. It can't just be full of, I mean, even the Jabberwocky lapses into comprehensibility from time to time. So I think it can be possible to make a conspicuous choice that seems then ugly for its overt materiality. I think there's a certain kind of camouflage work that needs to be performed in order to achieve the appearance of naturalness. If a line doesn't seem but a moment's thought, the stitching and unstitching, the hours of work, seem to be useless. You want to appear perfect with grace and ease. It's the kind of myth of Pygmalion all over you. You want to make a statue with which you can actually fall in love, not run around with your seams showing.
Exactly,
Yeah.
Exactly. And of course I'm thinking about the word rhapsody, which comes from the Greek word for to sew or stitch, rhaptane, and so a rhapsody is, the rhapsodes were the people who knitted together, stitched together stories. So, yes.
Well, maybe we'll move on before.
Unless there's someone wanted to throw something from the
I
audience.
just have
Yeah.
a quick question, if I may. The conception of a museum strikes me as kind of odd because it has a certain archival quality to it. And I've never thought of poetry as archival. I might think of it as a sandbox, if one thinks about it as an experimental space, if you will. But not that it's a dead end or an archival experience, that it's something to be experimented with, decontextualized, and then that reconstruction, that novel construction, can then feed back into conceptions of language or into new uses that may have been limited by prior usage, if that makes sense. So I think of it as more of an experimental space than an archival space, if that's an appropriate observation.
I guess it depends on how we're approaching it. If certainly each poem fixes language in the way that a lexicographer fixes it in its unique temporality, right? So Yeats is publishing this poem sometime after the First World War. So we get a snippet of what language looked like in that context at that time. Certainly we wouldn't speak entirely that way. So it does create, that kind of fixedness. I think an anthology, too, is a kind of document that has an archival quality, if you look at poems over the course of history. But I don't disagree that poetry is in conversation with itself and with the language we use. It was a great frustration of W.H. Auden's that he would be on an airplane, for example, and say he was a poet, and somebody would say, me too. Okay, like if I said I was a cellist, nobody would be like, oh yeah, I can do that.
Brain surgeon.
Yeah, right. I got my scalpel right here. Yeah. So he started saying he was a medieval historian, actually, just to keep, but so there is a sense that this is in the mouth of every human being. We share these materials, but in some cases they're isolated and maybe elevated as a result. So I think yes and more would be
There's a hand over here.
When you mentioned a quote, the coldest word used to be a glowing metaphor, and then you talked about that little story of the golf ball. The golf ball gets somewhere, and then someone picks it up, cleans it, and puts it back into circulation. And I heard Madeleine Albright do an interview today. I think she was on The View, and last night she was on Colbert. And she just wrote a book called Fascism. And when you said that, I thought to myself, how do you wash words like, look at the words Nazi and fascism, and when you said that the coldest word used to be a glowing metaphor. And, the book sounds fascinating. Of course, I haven't read it yet, but it was, can you comment on that? And one thing she said about the book is she talked about the different countries that are coming up with different fascist elements. And she said that, I think she said that Mussolini said that pushing fascism into the population is like plucking a chicken. If you do it all at once, people freak out, but if you do it feather by feather, then people don't notice, and then you have fascism. So I just thought I'd throw that
You have a bald chicken.
bald dictator.
But,
Yeah.
how would you, just a comment if you can about, those two words are, probably in our lexicon never going to change. They'll always be reviewed as, the way people think of them now.
Isn't fascism derived from the word for bundle of sticks,
Yes.
which informs the fascia in our
Yes.
muscles? I think we've recovered it already. If we think about sticks and muscle tissue and recognize the cold-hearted metaphor at the center of that, then we're having a different discussion than something as absolutely debilitating and dispiriting as a resurgence of... but I'm a poet, so I'm running to the mark. I'm not Ezra Pound. in support
Yeah,
of
the
Mussolini.
fascist as a bundle of sticks as a symbol of authority. You can see drawings of the fasces.
Fasces, yeah.
But it's that symbol of authority. I saw another hand there.
Yeah, I have a comment that might help in terms of the museum. I learned this from my philosophy teacher, by the way. And something slightly different but apply. And he says the shoemaker makes the shoe. The regular person wears the shoes, but it's the dancer who finds the vortex of the shoe. So it's in some ways like poetry. Poets are the one that find the vortex of words. Not necessarily even the meaning, but the vortex of how it comes So that might be helpful.
What was the last part of that? The shoemaker makes the shoe?
Yeah, and the regular person wears the shoes, but the dancer.
Oh, the
is the one that
dancer.
finds the vortex.
Yeah.
Oh,
Beautiful.
wow. Yeah, that is nice.
Yeah. Valerie says that poetry is dancing, whereas prose is walking. So he's drawing a similar. Well, I don't want to neglect you, so I'll move through this one quickly. If we can imagine that Yeats is suggesting on some level that the beauty of language is language abstracted from use, it seems to me that Dickinson is making almost the diametrically opposed case, that it's language overcharged with meaning, not relieved of meaning. And she, the speaker of this poem, is dwelling in possibility. I dwell in possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors, of chambers as the cedars, impregnable of eye, and for an everlasting roof, the gambrels of the sky. Of visitors, the fairest, for occupation, this, the spreading wide my narrow hands to gather paradise. Gorgeous, and maybe even overwhelming poem that does exactly as she describes. It's her, she has many poems that could be construed as ars poeticae, but this one seems particularly pregnant with value and meaning. So I don't want to lean too far in, because I know actually that we are.
Talk more about that.
Yeah,
It's such a cool poem.
That suggests that the quality of the poem is sort of the quality of the pun. Language that can house more than one value simultaneously. And so it's a superfluity of meaning, not the, as I said, not the isolation from denotative sense, but the multiplication of denotative values at the same time. And I think that really is, she's really, I think, making an incredibly persuasive case that a poem is typically an object to which meanings are attracted. They congregate around, sometimes partial, sometimes full, but we often read the narrative situation of a poem as a fundamentally allegorical or metaphorical event, much as we do in this case. And then we find individual words that bridge the distance between their local context and other associative values that precede them and succeed them. And so it's an overflowing of meaning, a multiplicity as an aesthetic value. And certainly it rewards our attention more and more. And I think our greatest poets are the poets who do provide us with an opportunity to continually revisit, rediscover, and enhance our understanding. Maybe one of the ways poets dance is by way of changing words from one part of speech to another. I don't know that she's doing this entirely here. But it's known as anthemeria. It's something Shakespeare does constantly, moving the noun duck into the verb duck, behave like a duck. That's another dead metaphor that few people think about. You're behaving like a duck when you're dodging the thing that's coming at your head. But that's adding meanings to it. You have the physical creature and then the behavior and now all of our associations. But she imagines, I think, that the cultivation of possibility is the achievement of paradise, the narrow hands that can hold the infinitude that maybe we don't perceive, but of which we are a part, at any rate. And the poems then house that metaphysical quality by bridging the physicality or exceeding the physical limits of unity. And I think that's a way that, the pun is itself a kind of metaphysical event, in as much as it unifies disparate qualities in a single house.
Yeats is the one who says to the great-rooted blossomer, "I cannot tell the dancer from the dance."
Yes. Yeah.
Which is the kind of unity, apropos of the dancing, a kind of unity where bringing together the two poems that you just
Beautiful.
Discussed, in the sense that if one pulls us into a kind of museum space of separation of language and the other one pulls us into this multiplicity, we might end, as Yeats does among schoolchildren, saying, "I can't tell the dancer from the dance," which is a critical position. And so if Malachi is going to be our poet, I'll be our critic for the day.
Oh, you.
I can at least pretend to be. And so I was thinking about beauty from a more critical perspective, and so I'm going to bring us a little bit down to earth. Thank you. By sharing with you a small quotation from a Marxist critic, Terry Eagleton. It's about, he's talking about the idea we often, I think, accept today, although he's looking at 18th century moral philosophers, people like maybe Shaftesbury, when he's talking about this, but the idea that we somehow intuitively know what is beautiful. You know, that we know, when you see it, that's beauty, right? And moreover, that it strikes us immediately and fully and persuasively so that we can start getting at why it is Mother Rosalie Hill would put truth and beauty together. That is to say, you know truth. A lot of moral philosophers in the 18th century would argue, you know truth precisely because it's beautiful, right? And its beauty is what reassures you that it's true. Well, that's what Eagleton, the Marxist, wants us to be a little more critical about. Perhaps there is somewhere within our immediate experience a sense with all the unerring intuition of aesthetic taste, which discloses the moral order to us. Such is the celebrated moral sense of the British 18th century moralists, which allows us to experience right and wrong with all the swiftness of the senses, and so lays the groundwork for a social cohesion, more deeply felt than any mere rational totality. And this, the last sentence is what I wanted us to look at. If the moral values which govern social life are as self-evident as the taste of peaches, a good deal of disruptive wrangling can be disposed with. What happens if we allow our sense of what's beautiful to tell us how to think about important moral issues or political issues? What happens if we do that? What happens if we let beauty become too central in the way we evaluate and make our moral judgments? Well, Eagleton's suggesting that when we do that, it's kind of like when we bite into a peach. I mean, when you bite into a peach, you know right away it's delicious, right? I mean, it does not take long at all for you to be utterly swooning over the beautiful flavor that's on your tongue. You're persuaded right away. So to what degree do we engage with our moral values and our discerning of truth like that when we let beauty become too important to us? This is the question I would ask. Should we be worried about putting beauty and truth together? I mean, this is what Eagleton is suggesting. That, because what would happen if we put beauty and truth together too firmly? We would get rid of disruptive wrangling, right? We potentially would rob ourselves of the kind of rational debate, the critical perspectives, the back and forth, and it might all go too smoothly, like the taste of peaches. Yeah.
I mean, this is kind of Hume's point, right?
Yes.
About the origins of moral judgments and aesthetic judgments and their relation. And the point that Hume's ancestor, predecessor, whatever the people come after him are, the point that the Humeans make is not that it gets rid of the disruptive wrangling, right? But the disruptive wrangling isn't really where the action is. It's kind of this post hoc rationalization, right? That's aimed at justifying your already aesthetically justified moral beliefs, rather than leading to an openness, right, to new beliefs about morality, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you've already got your answer. Now you're just telling a story
Right.
about why that answer
Yes.
is the one that you got.
Yeah, so it seems like that's the shape of, I think Eagleton and Hume and Wittgenstein are in agreement that ethics and aesthetics are one and the same. And that it's maybe a fraud to assert that there is a rational underpinning for our preferences for systems of order. That's what they seem to have in common. How we should organize society versus how a canvas should be ordered, how a piece of music could be ordered. I mean, there is maybe an innate response we have to structure. And some of us prefer formal structure, filigree, some Baroque or Rococo, and some really like a flat minimal edge. And that might be a more equal distribution, or you know.
Yeah.
So is it stratification we love, or something tidier? I don't know.
I'm tempted to substitute cilantro. Do tasted peaches.
What does that get us, Jessica?
Well, I mean, I've told the people in the room, I understand people respond to the taste of cilantro very differently. I'm a cilantro lover, but there are other people who, for whom it tastes like soap and, weed poison.
Yeah, I was
Right.
gonna say onion, but cilantro is perfect. Or you have disagreement about how to pronounce it too. Cilantro, but I think it's a
But it's a great question. Do we think beauty functions more like the taste of peaches or the taste of cilantro? Right? Because obviously you're complicating the idea of beauty when you do that. Some people will respond differently, and there's all this context and cultural stuff too, probably depending where you were raised. You might have different ideas about cilantro. But I think implied in your comment is that everybody who bites into a peach is going to love it.
Yeah, most are really disappointing though.
So you want to go organic.
Keith?
So I'm thinking what this is concentrated. This is a static picture in my mind that you've got here, rather than something that has a dynamic over time. And I think that really needs to be considered is how things change over time. Whether you think of it in the context of food or anything else. And that's maybe the cultivation of liking something. You know, the first time you have a beer, you might not like that beer, but over time, you cultivate a taste for it.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the same thing. So I think there has to be some taking into account of the time element and the dynamic of that.
Yeah, the intuition that's present in the idea of taste. I mean, taste is such an immediate thing. I mean, it hits your tongue and you know whether you like it or not, presumably. But in fact, you're saying, no, it's not so immediate. Yeah.
I like the idea that morality is an acquired taste.
That's nice.
But at least according to the critique Eagleton's setting up, if morality is an acquired taste, then in fact there is going to be a certain amount of wrangling, and one result will be that there'll be less social cohesion. That is to say that there is something conservative and cohering about us all agreeing that truth is beauty, right? We all see it, we all agree, and that's that. But if someone comes along and says, well, beauty, for my beauty is not the same as your beauty, therefore my truth may not be your truth. Now we're into pluralism and all sorts of social cohesion becomes much harder to achieve.
Yeah, I'd just like to, we hear over and over the beauty of the eye of the beholder. And I'd just like to push that, I guess, a little bit and say, well, there are some things that are just like objectively beautiful, and that if you don't find them beautiful, you're wrong. You know, like if you show someone the Grand Canyon, and if they're just like,
That's ugly.
and then consideration of the time thing, right? So like, 5 years ago, if I listened to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony or something, I might be like, meh.
Yeah.
But then I'd just be wrong because I'm uneducated or like haven't been exposed to it the right way, like beer, which I also thought about. But yeah, so in some sense, I want to say that beauty is somewhat objective in the same way that we could say truth is. But how I might cash that out, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Read Cant.
And we'll discover beauty there.
Yeah.
Yes, my friend.
While there is a relationship, and I will accept that, when it's too tightly bound, the problem is I'm afraid of seduction. Because we could be seduced into something that's not true.
Yeah.
And seduction, and we're all tempted by seduction. So that's what I'm more concerned about. Even though there obviously is some relationship, you can't create a one-to-one relation. Otherwise, it's like,
Yeah.
you'll be seduced. People are seduced politically.
Yeah. And people, why is it that America keeps voting for the president with the better hair? It's the taste of peaches, right? You're not thinking about the policies, you're not thinking about the effects and the history, you're thinking about which is more beautifully pleasing in that intuitive moment of relationship, and you're allowing that to dispense with the wrangling and just make your, and so there are any number of ways that we can easily be seduced by beauty. That's a critical perspective. I want to end my little bit on on trying to recover us a little bit back to, I think, the more friendly terrain that both Martha and Malachi brought us through with regard to beauty, by giving you a couple of 3 little bits from a recent brilliant book called The Limits of Critique by Rita Felsky, which is very much a response to this kind of Marxist critique here, and really a response to much of the critical landscape of the last 40 years or more, in which she talks here a lot about what she calls the hermeneutics of skepticism, which is a phrase she borrows from Paul Ricoeur. But the hermeneutics of skepticism, this idea that you're going to read and think in such a skeptical way about beautiful poetry, for example, or beautiful words, as to actually kind of dislodge them from what might be a more intuitive relationship, that's beautiful, and skeptically read past the text into any number of taking aparts and deconstructing and reading past. And so she's responding to what she takes to be an overly skeptical approach to things that otherwise might have more beauty in them than the current state of academia often wants to admit. This is to get at that complaint that we in the English department regularly hear from some freshman who says that she doesn't want to analyze the poem because it'll ruin its beauty, right? So the task, so 3 little bits. The task of the social critic is now to expose hidden truths and draw out unflattering and counterintuitive meanings that others fail to see. This is my work, that's what I got paid for. The modern era ushers in a new mode of militant reading, what Ricoeur calls a hermeneutics of suspicion. Now, the middle one is Felsky saying, making clear that she's not trying to be reactionary here. Academia has often been a haven for the disgruntled and disenchanted, for oddballs and misfits. Let us defend without hesitation the rights of the curmudgeonly and cantankerous. Reigning in critique is not a matter of trying to impose a single mood upon the critic, but of striving for a greater receptivity to the multifarious and many-shaded moods of texts. And the final one, you might have to duck, Malachi. Why, even as we extol multiplicity, difference, hybridity, is the affective range of criticism so limited? Why are we so hyper-articulate about our adversaries and so excruciatingly tongue-tied about our loves?
Beautiful.
I have nothing else to say about that except to see what you have to say. Or either of you.
I do think the genre of appreciation persists in contemporary letters, that kind of Walter Paterian pleasure. Maybe, but still praise is in general hard to come by. I don't think we take praise as seriously.
No, I make a point every so often when I get to a really awesome line of just telling people, isn't that beautiful, right? But probably not all that often. I don't sit there and tell my students about the beauty of poetry. I tell them about, how to read the sort of political under subtends, how to read past the text into something about gender. I get into the hermeneutics of suspicion naturally all the time. And then sometimes I pull out and go, wait, this is beautiful, right? And they're always so glad that I do. It's necessary, but it comes secondarily sometimes.
But really, not that often? You're not, you're reading beautiful poems, I take it.
Oh, yeah. But the work of analysis?
We have that in music, that exact same problem. I don't want to know more about this piece of music, how is it constructed, because then I'm losing my affective relationship with the piece of art. The students are generally afraid of having the beauty explained away, so to speak, or not seeing it anymore, because it's all about feeling, isn't it? Beauty isn't understood necessarily through analytical thinking or through thinking at all, but through an involuntary, almost affective response that to pull students away from that into the intellectual realm doesn't necessarily lead them back to what then my conclusion always is. For me, this is so exciting. I know there's some symmetry and some balance, and I find the work more beautiful than I did before. So if I break out in this kind of, you know, isn't that beautiful? And then often I find, why?
I think there are perils of connoisseurship. I mean, I think the more you become a connoisseur in an area, the more discriminating you are, the less actually meets your, the less work actually satisfies you. Because once you start to perceive these flaws, then it does become harder to, like when I was a high school student, I read these like fantasy novels, science fiction novels, and I love them. I can't read them anymore. I couldn't read them if I tried. And if I did, I would just be frustrated. So connoisseurship, I mean, maybe you can appreciate the things you like with more knowledge. Maybe they're somehow more satisfying, but it does sort of delimit the things that can satisfy you.
And in the 18th century, the musicians there were two kinds of musicians, the connoisseurs, they call them, and the amateurs. Now the amateurs are the music lovers. Now we today say an amateur is someone who's kind of not serious about it and is not good at it. But in the 18th century, the amateurs were the true ones that had a connection with the art. And the connoisseurs were, there's suspicion about them.
There has to be a bridge, though, and I think it's the auto mechanic for whom all things, no, seriously, for whom all vehicles are beautiful. And if you become interested in how they work in coordination, then there's not a car that doesn't really meet your interests. I mean, it may not be to your taste, but it's not something one can't appreciate because the coordination of parts. I think that's something, I mean, that's pluralism, like, in a way. Although, yes, there are many specialized mechanics, and forget them. They're connoisseurs.
I'm thinking of the word dilettante too, which comes from the Italian for delight, right?
Yes.
Amateur and dilettante, yes.
Yeah. Keith.
If we think of, so what about the difference between then, if we're looking at maybe between happiness and joy? Because when we're talking about beauty, maybe does it inspire joy or does it inspire happiness? What's the difference there? What is that quality? That's an interesting question that I would want to answer.
I think, Mike, you better answer this.
I don't want to answer that because I don't like to complicate it. It's interesting to me because it reminds me of this like distinction that goes all the way back to Plato's Republic between the difference between the lovers of sights and sounds and the lovers of ideas and the lovers of knowledge.
Yeah.
And, in Plato's mind, of course, like if you could transcend the access point through the physically beautiful, the effectively compelling, to rise up to the intellectual, that like in the end, like you would just broaden your scope of experience in the world, and that was kind of what was good and beautiful and true in some ways. And so the trick is in some respects like how to kind of maybe get this question of learning back into the conversation so that we can kind of cultivate the sense of moving from the affective to the intellectual, so that these things aren't dichotomous or like falsely dichotomous or something.
Right.
So, I don't know, but the reason I raised my hand then after Keith's question is because Plato doesn't ask the question in the context of the divided line there about happiness and joy, but he does ask the question about the difference between pleasure and goodness, right? And that becomes a kind of effective guide by which he really wants to kind of compel us to see the importance of the unity of these things, that we enter into goodness through affect.
Right.
Which I think Malachi was saying something about like earlier when he was talking about Yeats, perhaps. I don't know.
But then Eagleton broke my heart because,
That's what he's there for.
yeah. So I don't know. That's an interesting critique of the Platonic model, that if you're voting for a president's hair, then how far up the ladder are you actually, what's human potential in that respect? Are we natively driven, I don't know. I mean, certainly by sex in the symposium, right? That kind of pleasure, yeah, maybe engenders a greater appreciation for the beautiful. But if it's this beauty of an idea, I don't know, people seem to change the channel then. Yeah.
Yeah. When I said hair, I knew we were in the wrong place. Yeah.
Height, I think it is. Right? They always vote for the tall one.
Is there one last question before we close down?
Nobody?
Do you have one?
Voting, well, I have a comment. You were talking about voting for the president with the best hair, and then I saw that picture of Trump going up the stairs of the airplane, and blew his hair up, and somebody had written this comment that said it looked like the back end of an ostrich.
That's almost beautiful.
But it's worth noticing how shocking that picture was.
It was.
Because
yeah.
it was a shock to our system to have a president with bad hair. I mean, there are plenty of shocks, and this might not be the greatest. Yeah, this might not be the greatest of shocks to issue from this presidency, but
It all comes down to hair.
Might be the color of peaches, but not.
It was compared to a beer ball that had rolled around on the floor of a dog grooming place.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, my. All right.
I have a couple of just, if I could just
Please
maybe
do.
tie it
Yeah,
all,
yes,
try to
we'd
tie it
love
all
that,
up.
Martha. Thank you.
Malachi mentioned the word anthology, which just made the hair stand up on the back of my neck, because who knows the roots of anthology?
Flower?
Yes, yes, it comes from the Greek anthos, which means flower. You see that in anthurium and chrysanthemum, which is a golden flower. So an anthology is literally, or in the literal sense, a literary bouquet. Isn't that just gorgeous? So, and if I could just conclude with, we talked recently on the show about a book called Landmarks. Has anybody read this? It's by Robert McFarlane. And what he's trying to do is reclaim the language of people who are out in nature all the time, whether they're fishermen or shepherds, miners in England. And so he just has thousands of words in there that we're losing because most of us don't work with nature in that way. And I just love this quote that I thought would be a good way to end today. He writes, "There are experiences of landscape that will always resist articulation, and of which words offer only a remote echo, or to which silence is by far the best response. Nature does not name itself. Granite does not self-identify as igneous. Light has no grammar. Language is always late for its subject. Sometimes, on the top of a mountain, I just say, wow." That's beauty.
All right.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Magnificent.